Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tackling Other Causes of Our Changing Climate panel. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our gold sponsor, Chapman, Kubine, Allen, and Hussey. So let me just go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Stephanie Feldstein, Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. Her work addresses threats to endangered species and wild places as a result of human population growth and overconsumption. Next, we'll have Lewis and Clark's Professor Melissa Powers. She's the director of the Green Energy Institute, which seeks to develop a comprehensive strategy to further our transition to a 100% renewable energy grid. And then finally, we have Natalie Mebane, Associate Director of U.S. Policy at the Organization 350, whose mission is to build a future that's just, prosperous, equitable, and safe from the effects of the climate crisis. We'll go ahead and begin with a presentation from Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Feldstein. I'm the Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. The Center is a national nonprofit conservation organization, and we work to protect wildlife and wild places. But we not only work to do that through protecting endangered species and the places that they need to live, but also by addressing the underlying issues that threaten all life on Earth, including the climate crisis. We also believe that the well-being of people is intrinsically tied to the well-being of wildlife. So we work on the issues that really connect environmental harms and harms to people, things like energy justice and food justice, and working toward a sustainable food system. And in the Population and Sustainability Program, we work on how humans impact the planet and what are the solutions that can benefit both people and wildlife. And so today I'm going to really talk about that, obviously specific to climate change, and talk about the relationship between population growth and the climate crisis. And not just how population growth is a factor in the climate crisis, but also how the solutions to population growth, advancing human rights, healthcare, and equity are so important in their own right, and also serve as important mitigation strategies as we face climate impacts ahead. And so why do we talk about human population growth? There are 7.8 billion people on the planet today. When An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006, there were 1.2 billion fewer people on the planet. It was not that long ago. And in 1970, at the first Earth Day, there were less than half the number of people on the planet today. Human population has been growing very rapidly. In fact, prior to 1800 and all of human history up until about 1800, there were fewer than 1 billion people on the planet. And from there, our population really skyrocketed. And a lot of the factors that led to that population growth are also things that ultimately wound up driving the climate crisis. Things like the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution. There, of course, were also important advances in sanitation and healthcare that help people live longer and healthier lives. And while all of this may be arguably better for our species, it hasn't been better for other species, because as we've seen human population grow, we've seen a similar curve of a growth in the rate of wildlife extinctions. And I say arguably good for our species because, of course, now we're experiencing the return on what we've done to the environment. I live in the Pacific Northwest. I haven't been able to go outside in about a week because of hazardous air quality from the wildfires. And of course, the wildfires are enormous out here. If you don't live in the area, it may be hard to comprehend, but there are more than 5 million acres that are burning. There's smoke that's reaching across the United States, hazardous air quality in this area. Tens of thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes. Hundreds of homes have been lost. And the last count that I saw, around 30 or so human lives have been lost as well. And of course, these wildfires are fueled by climate change. We've seen historic droughts in this region that have really dried up forests. And we've seen record-breaking heat waves. And in some areas, it hasn't even been cooling off at night. And the interconnection between this and population and the impact on people continues to get worse as well, especially as we expand and build closer and closer to fire-prone areas. But it's not just wildfires. When we look at the US coasts, of course, it's hurricane season as well. It's not just wildfire season. And about 29% of the US population lives near the coast. It's about 60 million people in the path of a hurricane. There are other climate impacts as well along the coast. There's a threat of sea level rise and flooding. And we've seen the growth along coasts happen at a faster rate than the overall growth of population in the United States. In fact, we've already seen our first community of climate migrants in the United States, the Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana, where more than 98% of the community's land was lost to rising sea levels, coastal erosion, frequent flood events, hurricane damage, and it forced the community to resettle to safer ground. And in this community in particular, it's largely indigenous. And this is a community that was originally forced to leave their homes on the Trail of Tears. And now they're once again being forced to leave their homes through no fault of their own. And this is what we often see, is that the people who are most affected by the climate crisis are those who contributed the least to it. And when we look at this worldwide, it's estimated that there are about 150 million people who live in areas that will be underwater by 2050. It's estimated that climate migrants for a variety of pressures caused by the climate crisis is between about 25 million and 1 billion people. The most commonly cited is around 200 million people who will be displaced by the climate crisis. And in a recent study that looked at, really, there's a narrow window of temperatures that humans can survive in. And the study looked at, if temperatures continue to rise, that within 50 years, about 3 billion people will be living in places that will be too hot for humans. And that includes major cities like Los Angeles and Paris. And although a lot of times people don't talk about population, and particularly the connection between population and the climate crisis, there's actually a lot of research that's being done in these areas, both on how population affects overall ecology and the extinction crisis, as well as specific to climate. And we recently created the Crowded Planet database, where we started collecting some of this academic research and writing that's being done on this topic. And we're seeing it really happening across disciplines, from demography to psychology, and from ecology to policy. And a few of the studies in the database that specifically talk about population and the climate crisis include one that estimates that global emissions could be reduced by an estimated 40% or more with slowing population growth. And that if we're able to slow population growth and move from the medium to the low scenario of UN fertility projections, it will not only result in fewer emissions, but also will increase income per person around the world. And in countries like the US, having one less child can save 58 tons of carbon emissions per year, which in that study that looked at different actions that people can take to reduce their carbon footprints, that having one less child was far above and beyond any other action that a person can take. So when we talk about slowing population growth and reducing fertility rates, I want to be clear about what we're talking about. We're talking about advancing human rights and reproductive rights. We're talking about social justice and equity. These are all things that are important in their own right, and that the environmental benefits that may come from them are really just secondary benefits to the need to advance these rights and equity. We're looking to improve quality of life, and we want both thriving people and planet. We're absolutely not talking about population control. We don't endorse any kind of coercion. We reject ecofascism, genocide, and eugenics. And we also don't believe that closing borders is a way to address the population issue. Population, like climate change, is a global problem. And when it comes to immigration policy and closing borders, while there are a lot of different arguments and ways to discuss these issues, it's often used as the cover for racist and xenophobic policies, as we're talking about population-related issues and the environment. So none of these things come into play on how we can move forward on these issues. It's also important to note that when we talk about population, we're talking about the combined impact of population and consumption. It's not just numbers alone, but it's that pressure of exactly what are people on the planet doing. This is an example that looks at municipal solid waste. And you can see that over the years, even as per capita generation of waste started to reduce, overall waste continued to increase. And that's because it's not just it's not just the carbon footprint, but it's also the number of feet that are on the planet. We can work to reduce consumption and minimize the impact of destructive production practices, but if our population continues to grow, the math just isn't going to work out. And it also works in the other direction as well. While every person on the planet has basic needs for land and energy, those needs are very disparate depending on where you live and the amount of wealth that you have. For example, if everybody in the world lived like Americans, we would need 5 Earths. We still only have 1 Earth. And as you can tell from this map, there's a huge amount of inequity in how resources are consumed around the world. And in order to advance sustainable development and have that planet where both people and the environment are thriving, there are actually many of these regions around the world where we're going to need to increase resource and energy use in order to improve quality of life and health. And that means that it's even more important that in countries like the US, that we reduce the amount that we're consuming. And now population and climate change are both complex issues. And we know that the climate crisis is driven by the fossil fuel economy. And we also have seen a number of studies that have shown that even if we were to make the transition to 100% renewable energy tomorrow, that unless we address the emissions coming from agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, that we still would not meet the necessary emissions reduction targets to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But even with all of that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified population growth as a multiplier of these environmental problems, that it aggravates the worldwide growth of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, that's not happening in an equal way around the world. The highest emitting countries emit 50 times more the greenhouse gas emissions than the lowest emitting countries. So these are complex problems that need to be dealt with together and in a lot of different levels, but there is no doubt that there is a connection between population and climate change. So while it's disingenuous to say that population is the sole driver of climate change, it also is disingenuous to say that there's no relationship between population and the climate crisis. And the Project Drawdown identified health and education as some of the top solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And again, when health and education translates to is educating girls in family planning, access to reproductive health care. Again, this is about equity, it's about equality and human rights. And so those things which we should be doing anyways are also part of the climate solution. And those are solutions that we should focus on. And not only do those help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they also help make communities more resilient. It's easier to adapt to the climate crisis. If people have to move, it's easier to do so when everybody is an equal part of the community and everybody has determination of their own reproductive futures and bodily autonomy. It also is worth noting here, though, that when we talk about population and climate change, that population is not a short-term solution. In the slide at the beginning of this presentation, I noted that the IPCC says that we have less than a decade to have our greenhouse gas emissions. There's nothing that we can do in terms of humanely and equitably addressing population growth that will change emissions within the next 10 years. These are things that we need to be doing anyways, but it's not going to wind up solving the climate crisis. But when you look long-term, not only will it help communities adapt, but you start to see benefits over the long term as you look further down, as you get more towards that 2050 mark, that as population growth slows, you see more and more benefits to the climate and to communities. And this is an issue that people are worried about. There are a number of reasons why people choose their family size, and this could be financial, lifestyle, concerns about birth or pregnancy, and increasingly we're seeing more and more people concerned about the environment, both uncertain about the planet that their children will inherit and uncertain about the impact that their children will have on the environment. And in a recent Business Insider poll, 38% of Americans agreed that climate change should be a factor in a couple's decision about whether to have children. And this concern is increasing. The Center for Biological Diversity has conducted national polls asking about people's perceptions and thoughts about climate change, human population growth, and other threats to wildlife. And in that survey, just in the past 6 years, we saw that more and more people are agreeing that human population growth is making climate change worse. And we're seeing fewer people who are disagreeing that these problems are connected. And we also see that when we ask people what the top benefit would be of addressing US population growth, that reducing greenhouse gas emissions came out on top. So how do we move forward and take positive action? First of all, it has to be grounded, again, in human rights and equity. I can't say that enough. That's a core part of talking about these issues. And it's about empowerment and bodily autonomy. Not only people having the right to choose not to have kids, but the people having the right to choose to have kids, to have the number of kids they want and when they want them, as well as the ability to raise those kids in a healthy environment. And although family planning, and we talk a lot about choice, is often presented as an individual decision, it is in some ways in that everybody should have the right to choose if and when they want to have children, but that personal choice is influenced by systemic factors that can include systemic racism, healthcare access, sex education, equity, and cultural pressures. And to talk about the fact of a few of those in the United States, nearly half of all pregnancies in the United States are unintended, and reproductive rights are under attack in this country. So it's not so easy for everybody to be able to choose if and when they want to have children, to have access to the healthcare that they need. There are also more than 19 million women who live in contraceptive deserts in the United States. That means that they don't have reasonable access to a health center where they can get the full range of contraceptive choices. And then when it comes to sex education, I mean, learning how this all works in the first place, only 17 states require program content to be medically accurate. And only 20 states in Washington, D.C. require that contraception is taught as part of a sex education program. That means in more than half of this country, they either don't need to teach sex education, or they can teach it with misinformation. They can teach abstinence-only sex education, which has been proven to be less effective. And what we really need is science-based, medically accurate, comprehensive sex education across the country. And then that leads us to what are some actions that you can take today? And number one is vote. It's 2020, it's an election year. And not just the federal election, but it's also important to pay attention to your local and state elections, because there are a lot of provisions having to do with rights and access to health, and funding for communities, as well as all kinds of issues related to consumption, both in food and energy, that happen more on the local level. If you're not sure if you're registered to vote, or if you need more information on what sort of options may be available in your area for mail-in or early or absentee voting, check out voteamerica.com. It's also important to support fights for justice. Again, these issues, they don't happen in a vacuum. They're all interconnected. And it's important that we reject any toxic rhetoric and false solutions when it comes to talking about the population issue. Can also support reproductive rights and education. Call your representatives. Reproductive rights and sex education are really always in play. And there are a number of issues happening right now, including there have been expansions of the global gag rule, which means that any clinics that desperately need funding, if they even talk about abortion, they can lose that funding from the US, meaning that there are whole communities that are then losing their access to reproductive health care and contraception. So there are a number of issues like that happening right now. Call your representatives, tell them that you support reproductive rights and comprehensive sex education. And then, of course, that other side of the coin, we need to end the carbon economy. We need a rapid and just transition to 100% renewable energy, and we need to transform our food system. And finally, last but not least, and on a more personal level, have the talk. Talk to your partner about whether or not you want to have kids, and talk about your contraceptive plan. Talk to your friends and family about these issues as well. The more that we talk about these issues, the easier it will be to remove the stigma around them, to remove the taboo, and make sure that more people are able to see how these issues are interconnected and how we can move forward in ways that are positive for people and the planet. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks very much to the organizers of this conference for including me. Thanks in particular to Liberty Mulcani for all of her assistance. I am going to be talking today about the use of offsets in emissions trading, or cap and trade programs, how those offsets develop to encompass forest and agricultural sectors, and how the actual experiences with these offsets call for a new approach. This approach should help achieve the underlying goals of biogenic offsets, including biodiversity and habitat protection, carbon sequestration, protection of forest communities and livelihoods, and other important goals, without compromising the integrity of emissions caps or the transition away from fossil fuels, and without giving major fossil fuel emitters the right to continue emitting into the future. Let's begin with an overview of emissions trading. In concept, emissions trading is quite simple. We start with an overarching emissions reduction obligation, such as a mandate to lower pollution emissions by a certain percentage or a specified amount. Under traditional regulation, each emitter would be required to reduce emissions by that specified amount, even if it is more costly for some emitters to achieve their goals than others. With emissions trading, a company that may not be able to affordably or efficiently reduce its emissions would pay another company that can easily reduce its emissions. We care about the aggregate emissions, and therefore we regulate with an aggregate cap. How companies meet that cap is up to them. That means they can buy and sell the right to emit through the buying and selling of emissions allowances as they see fit. This system theoretically should encourage compliance with the cap, but at a lower cost and with greater flexibility. Emissions trading in the United States had its most important early moment in 1990, when Congress created an emissions trading program for sulfur dioxide emissions under the Acid Rain Program. Shortly after then, in 1992, the international community negotiated the first multilateral climate change treaty, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which authorized emissions trading on a larger scale. Over time, the idea that greenhouse gases are well suited to emissions trading took hold. Since we know in essence that we need to set a cap that lowers over time, the idea is that we should use emissions trading to enable compliance with that cap to be easier. Here's how the mechanics of the program work. First, regulators set the cap or a series of declining caps. Second, emitters under the cap receive emissions allowances. Each allowance represents the right to emit a certain amount of pollution, typically a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Regulators may just give these allowances for free, or they may invoke the polluter pays principle to require each emitter to buy allowances, either directly or through an auction. The emitters then track their emissions. At the end of the compliance period, they must surrender the number of allowances that are necessary to cover those emissions. If the facilities emitted less than they were allowed to, they can either sell the excess allowances or hold on to them or bank them for future years. If some facilities have emitted too much, they have to buy allowances from another party or pay a penalty. These dynamics would continue as the cap lowers over time. Within each of the caps, then, we might have several emitters. In this graphic, the overall size of the cap is 1,000 allowances, with each allowance equal to 1 ton. There are 10 emitters, and let's assume that they each receive an equal amount of 10 allowances. That means that each entity may emit 100 tons per year. Let's assume then that entity 10 under emits by 10 tons. Entity 10 has 10 allowances it can either sell or bank for future compliance years. If entity 9 over emits, it will want to buy allowances from entity 10. And that's fine under emissions trading, so long as the total size of the cap does not exceed 1,000 tons. In theory, emissions trading is perfect for climate change because we have to achieve steady drops in our emissions trajectories over time. If we know that we have to follow curves that look more or less like the ones on this slide, we can set a series of caps that will enable us to meet those curves. I want you to notice, though, how these emissions curves actually drop below zero. This is because emissions actually have to go negative, which means we will have to figure out how to actually remove greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere to prevent catastrophic warming. Carbon dioxide lasts in the atmosphere for a very long time, hundreds to more than 1,000 years. And when it is in the atmosphere, it has a warming impact. So one good way to remove that carbon dioxide is through sequestration of carbon in the forests, soils, grasslands, and other systems. Emissions trading is arguably especially well suited for greenhouse gases. One, as I mentioned, we know we need a cap. Two, unlike some pollutants that have primarily localized impacts, greenhouse gases are well mixed, which means that they spread and mix throughout the atmosphere and thus do not create pollution hotspots. Three, so long as we reduce emissions, the argument is that it does not matter where the emissions reductions come from. And four, once we get to zero, the idea is that we can use biogenic removals to get us to that net negative level. With those ideas in mind, let's talk about how offsets and biogenic offsets in particular became a part of emissions trading. Initially, they weren't part of the climate treaty focus. In fact, most parties to the climate treaties opposed emissions trading because they worried that the largest industrial emitters would just buy offsets from other countries rather than reduce their own emissions and invest in new zero carbon technology. However, as those treaty negotiations proceeded, those who favored emissions trading suggested that developing countries could receive a fee charged on the emissions trades. This then turned into the trading mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol known as the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. In very simplistic terms, under CDM, a developed country can buy emissions allowances from emission reduction projects in developing countries. So, for example, if China, a developing country under the Kyoto Protocol, were to replace a coal-fired power plant with renewable resources, the resulting emissions reductions would be translated into allowances that it could sell to Germany, a developed country. Under the Kyoto Protocol, only developed countries, those in Europe, North America, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, had emissions caps. If those developed countries purchased allowances through the CDM, this would help reduce emissions in places that were not subject to the cap and potentially support sustainable development to some degree. The CDM, however, did not allow reduced deforestation or forest degradation projects to create offsets. Emissions reductions from these types of projects are difficult to quantify, and many of these projects can be temporary due to illegal logging, drought, disease, wildfire, and other factors. So they were not eligible under the CDM. But this created problems because many developing countries have substantial emissions from forestry, agriculture, and other land use activities, as shown in the upper left image, while many developed countries emit more from industrial activities. If industrial countries could support emissions reductions in developing countries, the idea went, this would yield net benefits to all of the different types of parties to the Kyoto Protocol. Parties then began to develop a mechanism called REDD+. REDD stands for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Under REDD, forest projects could create tradable allowances. The plus then stands for other objectives of sustainable forest management and protection, such as better forest governance, equity, biodiversity protection, compensation for ecosystem services, etc. So REDD+ aims to create a trading mechanism that would further these other values as well. Although REDD+ has been a part of the climate negotiations for years, it has yet to be codified in the climate treaties. Nonetheless, as other greenhouse gas emissions trading programs began to be developed in various countries, most programs began to authorize the use of offsets from forests and agricultures, at least to some extent. So while discussions of REDD+ continue on the international forum, forest offset projects have already been underway. Although forest offsets are the target of REDD, agricultural offsets, particularly those from animal agriculture, are also a focus of offset advocates. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization, more than 63% of agricultural emissions come from enteric fermentation and manure. So perhaps offsets, the idea goes, could be used to reduce those emissions too. This idea of livestock offsets has manifested in some ways with the development of biogas or anaerobic digestion facilities. These facilities capture the methane that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere and use it as a replacement for fossil gas. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas that does not last very long in the atmosphere. This means methane's warming impact is more potent in the near term. So, if we could support methane capture systems through things like offsets, the argument goes, we could avoid some near-term warming while we also work to lower emissions of other greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, that again can last in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. The last argument in favor of offsets from methane capture or reduced deforestation is that they provide necessary income streams to the forest and agricultural sector. In other words, the argument goes, offsets are fundamentally win-win-win all around. Except that hasn't exactly been true. First, the promises that we can reduce emissions from forests to offset emissions from fossil fuels only works if we can actually quantify the emissions reductions. And it turns out that it is really, really hard to do. While it's possible to quantify emissions from certain land use activities, many others are really hard to measure. Take logging just as one example. If trees are being logged for the wood products, some of the carbon in the tree trunks will stay stored in the wood product, so it's not emitted. If the tree roots stay underground, their carbon may stay in the soil and not be emitted in the air. If we're trying to quantify then how much carbon a forest may sequester or how much it may take out of the atmosphere, it's going to be very hard to do. This is because there are so many factors that affect how quickly forests grow, how much carbon they store, and how much carbon might ultimately be released, whether it's through logging or natural degradation and decomposition. The issue of leakage and additionality is also very challenging. Forest offsets are supposed to decrease net emissions, but ProPublica reported on how forest offsets are performing in Brazil, and the report basically showed that offsets were not actually leading to net forest protection. Instead, forest offsets were either being used to support management of forests that were already under conservation protection, which means they were not supporting additional emissions reductions, or that deforestation activity was simply shifting to areas not protected under the offset programs. This is a problem because offsets from forests are used in lieu of emissions reductions from fossil fuel emitters. If the offsets themselves are not real, then fossil fuel emissions can remain high without any corresponding reduction somewhere else. As a result of this, offsets might have the effect of raising the emissions cap. This can happen in two ways. One, the program can be designed to allow offsets from unregulated parties to be used. Under the CDM, for example, unregulated countries could sell offsets to regulated parties who did not have to therefore reduce their own emissions. Two, even if the program sets a cap to include the use of offsets, for example, if it says a party can use offsets to meet up to 10% of its own emissions reductions, that cap may still be breached if the offsets are from projects that do not actually reduce emissions. These risks manifested quite clearly in the fires we just experienced in the West. For example, an Oregon forest that had sold more than 2.6 million allowances into California's cap and trade system burned down. Those allowances were supposed to offset emissions for at least 100 years. Instead, we now have to contend with both the fossil fuel emissions and the forest fire emissions. Finally, offsets have raised significant environmental injustice concerns. For example, in California, oil refineries located in Richmond used offsets to comply with their emissions reductions. These oil refineries do not only emit greenhouse gases, they emit other localized pollutants that contribute to asthma, smog, and other problems. Local advocates believe that, but for the offsets, the refineries would have had to improve their operations and finally address their localized emissions as well. People who live near forests also have justice-oriented critiques. Some governments have asserted that they own the carbon rights to forests that are on indigenous lands. Some land managers have locked up parts of the forest entirely to preserve the offsets at the expense of traditional activities. Last, offsets are not necessarily linked to biodiversity or sustainability. If emissions reductions or sequestration are the only things that are measured, then monocultures are more likely. Similarly, if agricultural offsets focus only on methane rather than on humane treatment of the animals, offsets will have other unintended consequences. But that does not mean that the objectives underlying some offset programs, such as REDD+, are fundamentally wrong. For example, a study by Stanford showed that funding from offset programs did actually support forest protection. This was because the offset programs provided money that hadn't been available before. And the reality is we need that money. As this map shows, there is a great deal of carbon stored in biomass around the globe. And we cannot risk having that carbon released from a climate perspective, not to mention from a biodiversity perspective. But in my view, we shouldn't use emissions trading to secure that money. The reality is that we've entered into a devil's bargain of sorts. We will only protect forests or reduce agricultural emissions in exchange for allowing industrial fossil fuel emissions. That cannot last, however, because we have to eliminate fossil fuels entirely from our energy systems. We have already overdrawn our carbon budget so severely that it is scientifically impossible to undo the harm through biogenic emissions reductions alone. Instead, we have to rapidly eliminate all of our fossil fuel emissions, independently of biogenic offsets, while we separately address forest and agricultural emissions. We need, therefore, to abandon the use of offsets and instead pay directly and substantially to preserve our remaining forests and restore sustainable and humane agricultural practices. So where are we going to get the money? In my view, we should just print it. Let's just stop looking for trade-offs and just pay the money that we need to pay. And in exchange for those payments, we will, over time, reap the social, ecological, and economic benefits of better forest governance, sustainable development, biodiversity protection, and the many ecosystem services that healthy habits provide. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks for engaging with this topic, and thanks again to the Animal Law Conference for including me in this event.
Hello, everyone. I want to say thank you so much to the Animal Law Conference for having me today as a presenter. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how fossil fuel development impacts wildlife, how climate change impacts us all, and what are a few things that we can do about it. So, fossil fuel development and wildlife. Approximately 218,000 porcupine caribou migrate through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is the northernest part of Alaska. Now, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge has unfortunately been under attack for decades. And just a few years ago, in December of 2017, lease sales were authorized through the passage of the Republican tax bill. So now the area that has been a refuge and been protected for many years is now at risk of being opened to oil and gas drilling. Now, drilling leases. Just recently, in the last month or two, the Trump administration has finalized plans to open the refuge to oil and gas drilling. And the Gwich'in Nation, which are the indigenous inhabitants of the refuge, have recently sued the Trump administration to stop these leases. And, you know, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is the largest remaining stretch of wilderness in America. Pictured here are a few of the representatives of the Gwich'in Steering Committee, with Bernadette Dementef in the center as the executive director. And they often come to DC, fighting to save the place that they refer to as the sacred place where life begins. And so it's a very important place, both ecologically and culturally as well, to the Gwich'in Nation. A few other impacts on wildlife from climate change are example of the Great Lakes. As the water is heating up in the Great Lakes, they're having more algae blooms. New species of bacteria and viruses and other parasites are taking hold. And one particular parasite, the sea lamprey, has increased in size and feeding rates because of the warmer temperatures. And these parasites can kill Great Lakes fish, such as lake trout, brown trout, and lake sturgeon. So these are very important problems as that they are impacting the wildlife every day because of the results of warmer temperatures from climate change. Now, every animal is affected by climate change. No matter where they're located, what part of the world, what environment they inhabit, every living thing on Earth is affected by climate change, especially humans. Now, this is a picture taken back in 1905 of Braddock, Pennsylvania. Braddock is a pretty small town right outside of Pittsburgh, right next to Pittsburgh. And this is a picture of the Carnegie furnaces used for steel production along the Monongahela River. Now, Pittsburgh in general is known for a, very industrialized history, very industrialized steel town. This is also my father's hometown. He was born and raised in Braddock, Pennsylvania, and we still have family there to this day. As you can see from just looking at this picture from 115 years ago, this was the environment that people lived in. The river was extremely polluted, waste dumped into the river directly from these furnaces, from steel mill production, and from all of this industry. You can imagine the impact that that has had both on the residents of Braddock and the surrounding areas, as well as on the wildlife that existed in that area and existed in these rivers. Now today, Braddock is not nearly as industrialized. It is a much different looking place in terms of Pittsburgh as a whole. Still does have some heavy industry though. But the rivers have definitely improved in quality in the last several decades, thanks to the cleaning up of industry and really enforcement of environmental laws that have come out in the last 50 years. So still definitely an industrialized area, but luckily doesn't look like this as it did just a short time ago. Now, extreme weather events. We have all seen the extreme weather events that are taking place all over the world and some of us in our own backyards. This is a picture that is taken recently. There's been extreme flooding in South Asia, across India and other countries. And this is going on all over the world, not just in South Asia, but in countries all over, and also in many, many parts of the United States as well. And this is just one example of some of the extreme weather events that we are seeing that scientists have always predicted is coming as a result of climate change. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, where we're dealing with these massive floods that are taking place, we're also dealing with massive fires. Now, as we all have seen, not just California, Oregon, Washington State, and overall at this current time, 7 states in the United States in the West are on fire. And this isn't just in the United States, this is also around the world. We're seeing massive fires in places that we previously never even had fires. We're seeing fires even in Siberia over this summer, where temperatures were hitting 90s, 100 degrees, in an area that is famous for being cold. An area that is known for being Arctic temperatures and Arctic conditions are now so dry and so hot that forest fires are now becoming a regular occurrence. And of course, they've always been, common in California and other parts of the West, but now we're seeing what used to be considered a wildfire, as Governor Inslee of Washington said recently, should really be called climate fires. They're no longer wild or natural in the way that we have known them. They are climate-induced catastrophes. As we've seen people's whole cities covered in haze and smoke and orange, that is not normal. That is not how it's supposed to look. And that is not the world that we are supposed to be in. So what can we do about it? What is it that we can do that can hopefully make a difference, that we can use to utilize our own power as individuals, but also working collectively to help change this narrative of climate catastrophe? And one of those tactics that we utilize, one of those tactics that is really important, is divestment. Now, the largest bank in the US will no longer fund fossil fuel extraction in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is the fossil fuel extraction that I mentioned earlier that has been proposed, and where lease sales, in terms of the authorization of issuing leases, has recently been issued, that they are now authorized to issue lease sales. So JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest bank in the US, has now, under extreme public pressure, both organized from individuals and organizations, has now said that they will not be funding extraction in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, this does not mean that they don't fund extraction in other places. They still do. But this is still an important step that shows that pressure can work. Now, why is divestment important? This is a quote from an article written about Chase Bank and JP Morgan Chase, and about why they actually decided to stop this operation in terms of funding these projects. Executives at the company presented a litany of policy changes, including ending the financing of oil and gas drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the last pristine landscapes left in North America. The bank also announced it would limit the financing of the coal sector and increase its investments in renewables. This comes days after an internal report by JP Morgan economists that was leaked, showing that the climate crisis could end human life as we know it. So these are the internal documents of JP Morgan Chase, of their own economists, saying that climate change could end human life as we know it. Now that is a very stark warning. And from what we have been witnessing across the country and across the world, it is very obvious and clear that we are not going back to the world that we were used to, and that we are going to have to adapt, adjust, and accept that the world has completely changed. Now, what we do going forward will determine how much it changes in the future and how worse it gets. So we have to take the steps now. Otherwise, we are committing ourselves to a future that I don't think any of us are interested in living in. And why, again, is divestment important? This is also from the same article. This move is yet another sign the finance sector is shifting away from fossil fuel funding, especially the most extreme forms of extraction. And getting JP Morgan Chase on board is a particularly big deal. The bank is the top funder of fossil fuel projects, according to an annual report released by the Rainforest Action Network. That it's backing away from at least some fossil fuel investments reflects the reality that banks, investment firms, and even energy companies are slowly coming to the realization that fossil fuels are a shitty investment. And they are. Not just because the price of oil has tanked because of the global pandemic and demand has fallen. Overall, it's investing in a fuel whose sole purpose is to power our world, but as a result, also kills it. Now, for me, that is not a good trade-off. I don't believe personally or professionally that we should be using energy sources that we know the trade-off is losing our world, losing our economy, losing our wildlife, losing our homes, and losing our lives. And so it is important that the US's largest bank is at least starting to see the writing on the wall and deciding that it's not worth it to continue investing in certain projects. Now, there's still much, much, much more work to be done. This is not simply a we've won type of effort, but we have to keep pushing collectively to ensure that these projects are not created. If you can stop the projects at the source, which is when they're planning to be built and they don't have funding, then you don't have to fight every individual drilling project or every individual pipeline, because it will be clear that this is not a good investment and these banks and insurance companies should not be making that investment. So what is happening at universities? So one thing that has really been taking off in the last 10 or 12 years is the university divestment movement. These are college students, faculty, alumni who realize that their schools, in a lot of cases, in some very historic, very wealthy schools, have billions of dollars in their endowments. One such school is Harvard University, which has $41 billion in an endowment. Now, this money is invested in order to, continue to grow, all the things that you would imagine benefits of having a lot of money invested. You no longer have to worry about really getting new money in. Your money just naturally grows, especially when it's at that amount. So this was an action that took place last year fall at the big Yale-Harvard football game. This is the highly anticipated Yale-Harvard football game, biggest game of the year for them, where hundreds, this says 150, but you can see from the picture, it's really hundreds of Yale and Harvard students together, coordinated, stormed the field during halftime and took over the field. They paused the entire game and were demanding that their universities, both Yale and Harvard, divest from fossil fuels and cancel holdings in debts in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of debt that a lot of different companies or universities hold related to Puerto Rico. And overall, their message was that when it comes to the status quo, nobody wins. And they chanted, they took videos, they took the field, and they really did delay the game for quite some time to get their message out there. And so this is just a quick look at what Harvard University students are doing to get their schools to divest. So they have a message of disclose, divest, reinvest. The fossil fuel industry is spending billions to lock us into a carbon dependent future that will exacerbate today's crisis of climate emergency, public health, systemic racism, and economic inequity. We are students fighting for Harvard to divest its nearly $41 billion endowment for this extractive industry and reinvest in a democratic, just, and livable future. We need urgent climate action now. And this can be found on a source. It's a Medium article that the Harvard divestment students have created, outlining exactly what they're looking to do. So the first one, disclose. This is what the Harvard students would like. They would like, we recognize transparency as a necessary prerequisite to ensure that Harvard's endowment meets the goals of the university and the communities it serves. Harvard must publicly disclose all current direct and indirect investments in the fossil fuel industry in an annual report. So first of all, the students want an assessment of every dollar that is invested currently within the fossil fuel industry. They want to know what is out there. How much are our tuition dollars and everything else in terms of its money that Harvard has, how much of that is actually going to fossil fuel investments? So that's the first step, is to take an assessment of what the actual university is doing. Secondly, their next plan is that they want the university to divest. We condemn investment in the fossil fuel industry for its role in actively perpetuating the climate crisis. Harvard must release a statement declaring a commitment to total divestment of the endowment from direct and indirect holdings in the fossil fuel industry, along with a comprehensive plan to achieve this. So the next step is, once they know what is invested, they want actually a plan of action of how they are going to remove those holdings. And they want it to be public so that they can keep track of what's actually happening. Now, the last step that they want is to reinvest. We call for Harvard to leverage its financial power for reparative justice by supporting environmentally sustainable, socially responsible, and community-based investment. We call on Harvard to work with the students, alumni, and faculty of Divest Harvard to establish new reinvestment principles. So they're not saying remove this money from the stock market as a whole. They're saying once you take it out of fossil fuels, you need to reinvest it into investments that are actually going to help this world. What is going to be an investment that helps make the world environmentally sustainable, socially responsible, and community-based? And so I have here pictured offshore wind. These are just an example of things that Harvard could use its $41 billion endowment to actually help promote. So it's not just reducing harm, it's saying, how do we use the resources that we currently have to make the world better? Now, lastly, what about your own role? We talked about major banks divesting and moving billions of dollars from projects that they could invest in. We also talked about major universities with billions of dollars in endowments and how they can use their money to actually benefit the world and improve the world socially and environmentally. Well, what can you as an individual do? So you don't necessarily run a university, or you're not an executive at a major multi-billion-dollar bank. There are a few things that you can do personally as well, and also within wherever you work, to help move whatever place that you're employed at to also make these decisions. So first is to ask yourself about your own investments. Now, this is either money that you might have for money-making stocks or for your retirement. Now, if you do have a regular job and you have, for example, a 401k or any other employment provided retirement account, that money is invested somewhere in the stock market. And a lot of employees likely won't ask where that money is invested. Is your company, or is your school, if you're a school teacher, is it invested in fossil fuels? And the first thing is to ask those questions. Whoever it is that manages your 401k at your job, or just really asking whoever is in your operations department and inquiring. And if you do find out that your money is in fact invested in fossil fuels, start organizing internally with your colleagues to change that. This has been a move that many groups have done, even cities have done, when they realize that their teachers' pension funds are invested in fossil fuels. And people have said, look, I think we should not invest our money there. We need to move it. Also, avoid banks who support fossil fuel projects. Avoid banks for your own personal banking needs that are using their funds to build projects that are harming us. And also vote clearly. You have to vote. That is a requirement if you're eligible to vote. And lobby personally for policies that stop fossil fuel development. Be in touch with your team of legislators. Talk to your state legislators. Talk to your representative in Congress and your senators who represent you, because they have to hear from you because you are the one and collectively employing them. Also, understand one main thing. We do not have time left to debate. We do not have time left to argue about climate change. It is here now. It is not something in the future. It is something that we are currently experiencing and will continue to experience. But it is up to us collectively how bad the impacts get and if we are going to do anything to address it. So that is your first step of making sure your own investments are not in dirty energy, but also collectively checking in where any place that you work to see if your job is also participating in that. And then figuring out the next steps of how you plan to combat that. So I want to thank everyone for coming today to my presentation. And of course, I'd love any other questions through writing if you have, to let me know if you have any questions about ways that you can divest personally or at your job.
So first, I think this question is for you, Stephanie. So given sort of the exponential human growth that you sort of charted there, or that chart that you offered, which was quite sobering, and given that consumption habits here in the US are far higher than those in other nations, what are your thoughts on whether and how the US government should encourage or incentivize climate conscious family planning?
Well, I mean, as I said in my presentation, the best and really only way to address this, is by advancing human rights, by advancing equity, and by advancing reproductive rights. And really the biggest thing that can happen right now in this country is making sure that we protect and expand reproductive rights, that we make sure that everybody in this country has access to quality, equitable healthcare, and that we really stop these attacks on all forms of healthcare, particularly reproductive healthcare, including the right to abortion. It's really important that we continue to protect all of those rights and expand, comprehensive, culturally sensitive sex education. I think that those things are really key to making sure that here in the U.S. that people are able to choose, their own family sizes, and to continue to educate people on the issues that we're facing, and then people will have that option to be able to bring that into their family planning.
Okay, thank you for that answer. For Natalie, for some of us workers who want to sort of divest from fossil fuels, for example, from our 401ks, is there a guide that any organization or your organization offers as to sort of how to effectively sort of navigate that divestment?
So I have not seen a particular guide created. I don't think there really is a kind of one size fits all. I think it really depends on whether, there's been efforts from teachers to have schools divest, school boards and things like that, or private companies. It's really something that's more of an internal decision. So it would have to be sort of internal organizing within whatever organization you work in, whatever type it is, to inquire, first of all, what are we invested in? Because I think most of the time we just don't know. We're looking at, is it growing? Is it growing the way that I expected it to? And we're not really asking, well, what is it in? So I think the first thing is just to start asking questions, start having even sometimes the actual 401k companies will come and do tutorials and answer questions. And that might be a good time to really start asking those questions. And if you find out it is invested in things you're not for, really pushing internally to say, look, I think we need to start switching. And if the current company doesn't offer that, finding an investment company that would offer what you want.
Okay, thank you. Melissa, you had a slide in which you talked about manure-based biogas, and a question that I have is, how sort of well equipped is that to sort of combat climate change, and so how sort of strongly should climate activists embrace that development?
It's a really tricky issue, because the minute you start thinking about manure-based biogas, you're thinking about, number one, perpetuation of natural gas infrastructure in many cases, or the expansion of infrastructure necessary to convert that biogas into gas that gets burned for the electric system. And we have a dynamic in any type of infrastructure system known as emissions lock-in or infrastructure lock-in. And the basic dynamic is that once you build a system, you are almost always going to use the infrastructure in that system throughout its economically useful life. And so pipelines, for example, might last 50 years. And so if we're adding a little bit of biogas to the natural gas infrastructure, that might actually increase the drive for some in the natural gas industry to actually expand the gas infrastructure, saying more of our infrastructure is coming from renewable resources. Therefore, it's becoming gradually more sustainable over time. And then as we build out more of the infrastructure, we might use more natural gas, and et cetera, and et cetera. And so I think it's really, really important that we not just look at any type of ad hoc or incremental replacement of a fossil gas with some type of biogas or any other resource that might have some downsides until we actually put together a meaningful energy transition strategy. And the Electrify Everything movement has really been thinking about what does it look like for us to completely decarbonize our entire energy system within about 15 years. And in those systems, to the extent that there would be any available biogas or bio-based electricity, it is going to be part of a bigger picture, and we'll know upfront what those resources are, how much they're going to provide, and when, if necessary, they're going to actually come offline. If we don't have that in place, then we're just going to accelerate the lock-in dynamic that already challenges us.
Thank you for that answer. For Stephanie, so if somebody does want to have a large family and also be climate conscious, what are some of the other issues that they should be sort of focusing on when they raise their family?
Well, one thing that's interesting that's been found in a lot of polls is that oftentimes people who have larger families tend to pay more attention to consuming less. And of course, there are a lot of reasons for that. When you have more kids, you tend to have more expenses. There's more sharing going on in households that have kids or a multi-generational household. So I think for many people that's sort of built into a way. But I think the biggest things that people can do is, one with their family is make sure that you're making the best choices that you can for your family, but also recognizing the larger systemic issues is you can start, even when your kids are young, teaching them about civic engagement, teaching them how to get involved in these issues and ways to ask for these larger policies that we need to really fight climate change. So I think it's important to have that balance of both the choices that we're making in our individual lives that, can help make an impact, and in some areas in particular, like food, can help shift markets in pretty significant ways, but also balancing out that with recognizing that not everybody has access to the same choices, and that from an early age, making sure that your kids understand that and bringing that up. One thing that I also want to mention with this, because this comes up a lot in Q&As, is a lot of people talk about the option of having 1 or 2 biological children and then adopting. And if that's something that's available to you and that you want to do, that's great. But adoption is also one of those things that can be really expensive and really complicated for a lot of people. So it's not always like an easy answer to, oh, just do that. And it doesn't always meet people's needs and the vision that they have for their families.
Thank you. And no more questions have come in through the Q&A, so I'll just ask a question sort of broadly, and any one of you should feel free to sort of speak to it. But what are your thoughts on sort of the plan that the Biden administration has sort of put forward, and sort of contrasting it to the Green New Deal? Do you think it will get us to where we need to be at the timeline that we need to get to sort of combat sort of devastating climate change?
I guess I'll jump in on that one, because I've actually been doing a lot of, I've been getting a lot of questions recently about Biden's plan and done different presentations on it. And, for me, I am sad that he's trying to contrast it with the Green New Deal. I wish instead he wasn't drawing those dynamics of being asked, do you support the Green New Deal? And he says, no, I support the Biden plan. And in reality, for anyone who has, read the Green New Deal, it's only 14 pages, easy read. Go ahead and Google it, read it. it is a high level goal of where we need to be in terms of achieving not just environmental sustainability, but actually a society that works for everyone. So saying things like, well, I'm not for the Green New Deal, will highlight the line that you are unsupportive of. Is it the racial equity and justice? Or is it the well-paying union jobs? Is it staying below 1.5 degrees? Like, which part are you objecting to is sort of the question. And the thing is, people might have different ideas of how to properly legislate to get to those goals, which is fine, because the Green New Deal is not a bill, it's a resolution. It is not a binding, enforceable law. There are laws now being bills introduced that are law, that are, the idea is to become law. But the actual resolution is just a target of where we need to be as a society. So for me, in terms of thinking of Biden's particular plan, I would personally want him to increase the amount of initial investment. He's currently proposing to do $500 billion a year for 4 years of initial investment for a just transition to clean energy. And I think that at the crisis that we're at, with the amount of time that science says we need to change our entire economy, we should invest even more, because we cannot look back in 4 years, 5 years and say, well, almost survived. That's not going to work. And so for me, I think it's better than where it started, but it could definitely be more ambitious. And so at 350 Action, which is our C4 arm, we are going to continue to push him even after, hopefully he's elected next week, since that's coming soon. So
thank you. I don't know if either one of you, Stephanie or Melissa. Yeah, Melissa.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Natalie said, but I think it is important to emphasize that the Biden strategy is the most ambitious climate strategy that we've seen from any president ever. And the investment, just to take that initial piece, is a government investment, but that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a bunch of private market investment in clean energy technology coming in as well. And, actually having more of that investment coming in from the private sector will just amplify the resources that are going into clean energy and ensure that we'll meet some of the other really important aspects of the Biden goal, which include 100% clean electricity by 2035. Now, there's a lot of details that need to be worked out with the plan. There's a lot of questions that I think are important to flag that could go both ways and could weaken some aspects of the plan. But I think that, especially when we right now are thinking about who's going to be voting and whether people should be voting and whether people should be optimistic, I personally think it's important to emphasize how ambitious this plan is, and how if we don't have Biden elected and his plan isn't on the table, we run the risk of not being able to mitigate climate change in any effective way for at least another 4 years. And so I just think it's really important for us to recognize that this is a bold project, and it could be much bolder as people continue to push the administration moving forward. But it's a good plan. It might not be perfect, but it's good.
I have just one more question that came to me through another channel. So Melissa, we're wondering if you could talk about some additional concerns that animal advocates have with respect to digester development, potentially increasing the number of CAFOs that are out there and sort of the attendant sort of animal welfare concerns.
Sure. So, first of all, I don't think that probably anybody who's watching this has to be told about the really horrific growing operations and the way that animals are crammed into different facilities and often are prohibited from moving, are often fed foods that they are not biologically well suited to be eating. They're basically overfed so that they can grow really quickly. They're fed hormones. There are a rash of growing operations that really ultimately, I think, have to be addressed. And there is a risk that if these big growing operations in particular have access to new revenue streams in the form of producing and selling biogas, that will actually increase their ability to have their business model perpetuated at the expense of the welfare of the animals. Another issue that I think is really important to think about is that typically those entities that have greater access to capital, as well as greater access to professional expertise, will probably be the ones that are most able to adapt the very complicated processes of developing a biogas facility and then interconnecting their energy into the electricity system or the natural gas system. That process is highly technical. It's really complex. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles. It's very expensive. And so if you're a bigger operation with more access to money, you're almost certainly going to be able to do that. And that could ultimately then outcompete the smaller facilities that might actually have the ability, because they haven't scaled up and are not so subject to economies of scale, to actually be able to pursue biogas facilities. So I think it's a real risk, and I think it cannot be we cannot look at the energy system as actually the way to mitigate these risks. We have to regulate in terms of the facilities, their pollution, animal welfare. I also think that from an economic perspective, the massive growth of livestock operations has really actually hurt the family farmer as well. And so if we're not dealing with farm reform, there's nothing we can do in the energy system that's going to mitigate that. If we don't deal with farm reform and we move towards biogas, we're only going to exacerbate the inequities and the harm to animals. So, but it's really not an energy system dynamic, really. Unfortunately, it's fundamentally a farm and animal welfare system.
Thank you for the answer. And thank you, Stephanie, Melissa, and Natalie for those wonderful presentations and this really engaging Q&A session.